think tanks of countries in Latin America, and we'll focus once again on the economy, public health, society in, as I said, a representative group of countries, and we have an excellent group who will be providing update on the impact and the trajectory of the COVID crisis in their countries. I have spent most of my professional career thinking, writing, and worrying about think tanks and the challenges and opportunities they face. This morning, I would like to outline the opportunities this crisis presents to those think tanks that see the opportunities in this crisis and are able to not only seize but to embrace these opportunities. The simple reality is that those think tanks that work to modernize and transform their organizations, to make them as modern as the marketplace of ideas and policy advice, were well positioned to quickly adapt to the many challenges that COVID-19 presented to all of us. Trends such as advances in technology, artificial intelligence, social media, strategic communications, knowledge production and management, digitalization, were already challenging how think tanks operate and forced many think tanks to rethink their business model for how think tanks are managed, staffed, produce policy advice, and how they are located and where they are located. Innovative ideas, policy analysis, and research will continue to be the core mission of think tanks. But what must change is how we communicate and deliver our research and policy advice. Having great ideas is no longer enough. We must reimagine what we do, how we engage policymakers and the public. That is what all of the summits that we have produced over the last 8 or 9 years have focused on. The existential threats and the related opportunities for think tanks were discussed regularly at these regional and global think tank summits. Then came COVID, which served to accelerate and intensify these trends and to, unfortunately, hasten the demise of many of our peer institutions. There is a silver lining in the COVID crisis. It forces us to explore new ways to deliver our products, expanded the reach of our conferences and seminars, and rethink our staffing patterns and reimagine how we utilize office space. I spoke with a think tank executive the other day who was not lamenting what COVID had done to him or his staff or his organization, but extolling how it had been a boom for his organization. They grew their staff and budget, without exaggeration, by 30%. How is this possible? By by transforming the management, research, communications, and staffing and program paradigm, they were able to do this. The process began well before COVID, but paid big dividends during COVID. Why? Because they created a dynamic, agile, adaptive, and innovative culture and organization. I will now close with a set of trends that I believe will require all of us to rethink the research, management, communication paradigms we have been laboring under for years. These trends are new, real, and existential. First and foremost, the trends outlined above will continue to accelerate and intensify, and the only constant will be change, and the disruptions will be the constant. There will be no new normal. Let me assure you that you should not labor under the fact that there will be a new normal. There will be no new normal. There will be no normal. There will only be a series of abnormal events and crises. And it will be like the impact of climate change on the weather. The frequency and intensity of these abnormal events will rise, and we need to be prepared as institutions to meet them. Thirdly, advances in technology, AI, the fourth industrial revolution, will accelerate change so that the rate of change will be compounded and reach warp speed. And so speed, complexity of these things will most profoundly affect, and this is the important message, information-based institutions like all of our institutions are. Fourthly, our lives, society, politics, and work will continue to be disrupted and transformed. 5, in an information-rich, highly competitive marketplace of ideas and policy advice, it is essential that think tanks provide evidence and information that cuts through the noise and negativity to provide a constructive way forward. We must be about clarity and consensus and results, not polarization and policy paralysis. 6, the crisis, and this I am fairly certain, is unlikely to be over any time soon. COVID is not going away and may be with us for another 3 to 4 years. So we need to get off the sidelines and onto the front lines so no one can ask, where were the think tanks when we needed them? We must be visible, active, and involved in saving lives and livelihoods. Finally, in my conversation with the think tank executive I mentioned earlier, he said that throughout the crisis, when other think tanks were shuttered and were not there, we were online, in person, and that became our competitive advantage. But we created a business model, a communications program, and a staff that was willing and able to adapt and to respond to a very fluid situation. These are opportunities. They are both a crisis, and as Winston Churchill said, we should never let a good crisis go to waste. We need to understand and not succumb to these realities, but to create think tanks that shape and are motivated by these realities, to create think tanks that are have sound leadership and a staff that embraces a paradigm that is open to new ideas, business models, and above all else are agile, adaptive, and innovative. We all look around us and we see restaurants, businesses, organizations that have not just survived, but have adapted and thrived during this crisis. And they are organizations that are characterized by an adaptive and innovative organizational structure. And we have all benefited from both think tanks and restaurants, social service agencies, etc., that have adapted and have been innovative in how they dealt with the crisis. We must do this. We must be open to it. We must create a culture that is adaptive and innovative, because the future will be turbulent and uncertain, and we need to have organizations that can respond to that, and as I've said repeatedly, not on the sidelines, but on the front lines. There are tremendous range of voices today that are intended to help provide a sense of what is happening, and more importantly, how, as institutions, we might respond to these challenges. They are opportunities if we see them. I'd now like to turn it over to the chair of the second panel. Fernanda?
Hello, good morning from Sao Paulo, Brazil, everyone. It is a great honor to be here representing the Brazilian Center for International Relations, SEBRI, where I am a senior fellow responsible for the United States program. On behalf of SEBRI, I would like to thank you, Professor Jim Magan, and the think tanks and civil societies program at the University of Pennsylvania for their partnership and the opportunity to be part of this summit. As Jean mentioned, this session will provide a regional overview of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Latin America. So we have a diverse group of experts from across the region who will explore the impact of the pandemic on the following areas: the economy, public health, politics, social welfare, and inter-American relations, of course. So I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. So first we have Júlio Croda, Associate Professor at the Faculty of Medicine, Federal University of Mato Grosso do Sul in Brazil, of course from Brazil. Alejandro Werner, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and former Director of the Western Hemisphere Department at the International Monetary Fund, IMF, who is from the United States. Then Fernando Filgueira, Head of Office at the United Nations Population Fund from Uruguay. Then Cornelia Schmidt-Linerman, who's politician, a former National Congresswoman, and an advisory member of CARI from Argentina. And at least my friend Professor Feliciano Guimarais, Senior Researcher at the Brazilian Center for International Relations, SEBRI, here from Brazil. Thank you all very much for being here with us today. Each speaker will give a 10-minute presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. I imagine Laura will be helping us to read the questions and so on. I will monitor the time closely. So, of course, we have several speakers and other sessions coming up for this one. We encourage everyone who is watching to send questions and comments via chat. And without any further ado, I would like to hand it over to our first speaker, Professor Júlio Croda. Professor, welcome, and over to you. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much for the invitation, for SEBRI invitation, University of Pennsylvania. It's a pleasure to stay here to talk about the COVID-19, the things that I do in here, and I work with this in Brazil. I follow the time, I try to follow the time and stay in 10 minutes speech. The idea is to show the impact of COVID-19, especially in the public health in Brazil. And I'm from Federal University of Mato Grosso do Sul, but also from Oswaldo Cruz Foundation and Yale School of Public Health. I like to show this slide from Financial Times that show the impact of the COVID during the entire pandemic crisis. And you can see the Latin America, the burden of COVID-19 is very high. In several countries, the Latin America, you can see Peru, Brazil, Mexico here, but also United States. I think that America is the region of the globe that have the COVID more impacted in the population, in this health, in the economy. And you can see in more recent days, you can see all these waves. You can see here, especially in Brazil and Latin America, when I have a new variant that's called Gamma variant that came from Manaus, you see this huge impact. And nowadays you hear a huge impact, especially in the India, and after that United States, related to the Delta variant. And more recently, especially in the India and the Africa, the Delta spread, and after that, United States. You can see also in these slides that Europa, and Asia, especially part of the Asia, can do restrictive measure and control the transmission. Here you can see that Europe have peaks of deaths, but this not occur in Latin America. And what's this lead in this special region? This indicator that for me is the best one, because you didn't count for the test performance. They call excess of deaths, and it's very easy to understand how the countries deal with the pandemic, especially related to the restrictive measures that is necessary to control the transmission, but also vaccination in nowadays. You can see here in the total numbers, you can see in the 5 countries, at least 3 its localization in the Latin America and 4 in the America, Brazil, Mexico, and Peru. When you look the burn of the deaths in the world, you can see the total excess of deaths per million people, Peru, Mexico, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Brazil also. And when you look the percent that of increase of excess of death, this is very important because during the time it's 1-2% the variation when compare different years. You can see here Peru, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, and this translation very well how the Latin America was impacted by COVID-19 pandemic. It's a special region. It's very affected by this pandemic. And show a little bit about the vaccination and how the vaccination distributes along the different countries. You can see you have a good profile in Latin America, and I show in details by the country, but it didn't have good access, especially to the African countries and some countries in Asia. This is very important for the future. You needed to you know that you move fast to offer the vaccination to all the countries, but it's still very low, and this is a big concern because it's important concern because this allow high transmission rates, and this can be lead. You can understand that in the future a new variant can appear in these places where have a high transmission rates, like in Africa and some Asia countries. And Brazil, you have is more dark. You do in the most recent months, you do very well, and you can show here the Latin America countries about the vaccination cover. This is the world rates. You can see 48%, but you can see several Latin American countries, it's above of this rate. And you can see Chile, Uruguay, and Brazil. It's the top 5 with Costa Rica, with like 70%, 73% of the population have already partially vaccinated, and half of the population is fully vaccinated. This make a great impact in your numbers. But you can look also Nicaragua here, Guatemala, Venezuela, Honduras, Bolivia, and Paraguay is below the median of vaccination cover in the world. You needed to deal with this. You needed to deal with the different access among the different countries in Latin America. And I wanted to show this slide because, as I said, you didn't have a restriction in all these countries in the Latin America. But one thing that makes difference for us is vaccination. High cover lead to us to decrease the number of deaths during the time, especially after May and July. The majority of the countries in Latin America do a great job in the vaccination, and you see this curve decrease in the number of deaths per 100,000. But I want to show here also the Guatemala, the countries that have the second worst vaccination coverage. And when you see in more detail, you can see that Guatemala have a plateau of deaths, especially during the last 6 months, that I show here. And Guatemala now have more deaths than Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, and Argentina and Chile. This is the kind of the information that's good to show, to demonstrate the impact and the cost effectiveness of to buy vaccines and to do a very big campaign for mass vaccination. This is the vaccine that each country buy for the future. You can see here Brazil and Mexico, it's a large countries, buy the majority of the vaccine. They cover all the population 1.5 times. And you can see that other countries do very well, but have some countries, especially the countries that have a low coverage of vaccination, still have a problem. Like I showed Guatemala, it's the second lowest vaccination rates, have this plateau of the deaths. You can see they only buy Sputnik V and have a problem. The Russian manufacturer have a problem to deliver the Sputnik V for Latin America, and this occurred in Argentina also, and in another countries that buy Sputnik V. In Brazil, you have you have the Gamma variant that impact between April and May, and nowadays the majority of the variant is Delta variant.
You have less than 2 minutes remaining.
Okay, thank you. And you can see, because the vaccination, even you have the Delta variant in the entire country, this is the best picture of ICU occupancy in the country. The Fiocruz monitor this indicator since the last year, and this is the best time to Brazil, especially in the number of the deaths, in the number of occupancy in the ICU beds. And the deaths is change a lot. The majority of the people that deaths in Brazil, that is the people that not being vaccinated or partially vaccinated, except for this group that now is boosted with the third dose. You have, this is my 3 last slides. You have 3 scenarios for the future. One pessimistic scenario that you can say that the virus continue to circulation with high mutation rates. You can have an emergence of new variant with great effect from immune response. And this is important because you lost the effectiveness of the vaccine. You need the vaccine adaptations and more frequent vaccination. You have the more realistic scenario, become endemic seasonal disease like influenza, with the acquisition of partial immunity by the global population. This is important to give access to the vaccine to entire global population. And this can be this more realistic scenario. You can think about influenza. Maybe you need to give a booster for a special group. And more optimistic scenario, the transition to endemic disease similar to other human corona infections that have low burden. It's less than influenza. I don't believe this. I believe in the realistic scenario, probably it's closer to influenza. I think I finished my presentation. Thank you for opportunity, and I'm here in the end to discuss this topic.
Thank you, Professor Croda. It was very interesting. And now, Professor Alejandro Werner, you have the floor. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and thanks to Jim McGann for the invitation to be with you and to be with such a great audience to discuss the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Latin America. As the previous speaker said, Latin America has been significantly affected by COVID in terms of health. I mean, we've seen death rates of around 2,100 to 1,800 per million people around the largest countries in the region, with very high rates, death rates in Peru, to much lower death rates in the Caribbean and maybe Central America, some important issues of measurement in the case of Mexico, where the difference between excess deaths and reported deaths of COVID is pretty large, maybe by a factor of 2. So sometimes the numbers should be adjusted by that. But now, I mean, as the previous speaker was saying, I mean, obviously cases and death rates are coming down significantly when we look at the last 2 months, on the back, obviously, of important vaccination efforts in the largest countries in the region and in some of the not so large countries in the region. As he was saying, I mean, Uruguay and Chile with relatively high rates of vaccination, of around 75%, a group of countries with around 50%, with Panama, Ecuador, El Salvador, and then another group of countries in the range between 30% to 50% of the total population being fully vaccinated. That, together with, I would say, a better than expected way to deal with economic activity during the pandemic, explains why almost everybody following the economies of the region has been updating upwards their growth expectations from the region. If you look at the path of growth expectation, obviously we had a very large downward revision in April of 2020 when the pandemic struck. Then another very large revision in the summer of 2020 when we realized how deep the recession had been in the first 4 or 5 months of the pandemic. But after that, within the context of a very bad economic scenario for Latin America, almost all the analysts looking at the economies of Latin America have been revising upwards their growth outlook for Latin America based on several issues. One is the spillovers from the rest of the world, as the advanced economies also started recovering relatively fast on the back of significant stimulus. Secondly, also, I mean, I think Latin America was able to put in place fiscal programs and monetary expansions that were much larger maybe than what we would have anticipated in the past. You can look at the case of Brazil, you can look at the case of Peru, even Colombia when you look at 2-year scenarios, except maybe from the large economies, the case of Mexico, where the government decided to be much more subdued in terms of unleashing a wide array of programs to support the population, to support small and medium-sized enterprises. Secondly, obviously, in terms of trade, have been helping the region with commodity prices up significantly, especially when you look at foodstuff, when you look at metals. And now we're seeing the last leg of the commodity recovery and strength on the energy side. And that is on the back, let's say, of this important recovery of economic activity. Having said that, I mean, Latin America last year contracted by 7%. This year is expected to recover at a rate of around 6%. So that means that we're not even going back to 2019 levels of activity. If you take the largest economies, Brazil last year dropped by around 4%. Brazil is expected to grow by around 5% this year, recovering levels of 2019. The same is the case of Chile, with a contraction of almost 6% last year, an expected recovery of 10% this year. The case of Mexico, contraction of 8%, recovery of 6% this year. So we have Chile and Brazil recovering levels of 2019. Mexico not doing so, Peru not doing so, Argentina not doing so. Maybe Colombia by the end of the year will be reaching levels of 2019. When you look at income per capita, I mean, that is going to be postponed, the recovery, let's say, until 2022, 2023. And that's why, I mean, many people have said that there's going to be another lost decade in terms, let's say, of income per capita in Latin America. If you start looking at 2014, all the way to expected 2024. And why is that? Because Latin America went through 2 very important shocks. First, the decline in terms of trade in commodity prices in 2014, 2015, that significantly stopped growth in terms of income per capita in Latin America, and now the COVID crisis. So when you look at those 2 shocks, and they're even taking into account a relatively decent recovery of after COVID, then it is very unlikely that the region is going to go back to levels of income that we saw in 2014 in terms of income per capita. So bringing us, let's say, to this name that people put to the 80s of the lost decade for Latin America. Also, when we look at this concept of scarring, what does scarring mean? That the economy will not go back to the trend that was expected before the pandemic. Even when everything, let's say, is back to normal, however you define normal. People are expecting that maybe in advanced economies, let's say, by 2023, 24, are going to go back to the level of GDP per capita that those economies expected to have before the pandemic. That's not the case of the expectations for Latin America and other emerging markets. Analysts are expecting that economic activity in Latin America will be 4% permanently below what we thought we were going to be before the pandemic. And this is because of the permanent effect of the pandemic hitting education, hitting physical and human capital in education, physical capital, small enterprises in the service sector, tourism, etc., not fully recovering the levels that we expected to have before the pandemic. Another very important gap. Perfect. Another very important gap, the social gap in terms of employment, especially women and youth, significantly affected. Then the fiscal gap that, countries are going to come out of this pandemic with much higher levels of debt and much higher public sector deficits. The social gap with, let's say, indicators of poverty and income distribution that maybe pushed us back 8 years. Some of that is going to be recovered during 2021, that the economies are recovering, employment is recovering, etc. But there's going to be significant permanent damage on poverty and income distribution. And also, I would say, a confidence in institution gap. When you look, this was already happening in Latin America, but there's a significant decline in the confidence on governments, on the judicial system, on other institutions, and that is going to continue. And we're finding a region that is more polarized, and in that sense, much difficult to undertake the key reforms of the social contract that might be needed in the future to put Latin America back in a path of sustained and inclusive growth. That is the channel, and the pandemic really should be forcing societies to rethink the social contract, to move to a much more inclusive contract with better health, better education, but at the same time you need more growth, and for that you need spaces for the private sector, certainty for the private sector, and that would need a significant new consensus. People have called it a new social contract for Latin America, and that, I think, it's very important for think tanks to really help societies construct that vision of the new social contract, and on top of that, construct the consensus to move ahead with that social contract. If not, it will be very hard for Latin America in a polarized system with such big challenges to be able to break from this very mediocre growth trend that already had before the pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Werner. I would like to remember you all from the audience that you can send your questions and comments via chat. So please do that and participate with us. And for our speakers, we are managing the time through direct messages as well. So please be aware of that. Now I would like to invite Mr. Fernando Figueira from Uruguay. Professor Figueira, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Fernanda, and thank you, Jim, for the invitation. I'm going to concentrate on the social impacts of the pandemic in Latin America. It has already been mentioned that Latin America was one of the hardest hit regions in terms of death and in terms of illness due to COVID. It also confronted a strong impact in economic terms, and this, of course, had an impact in terms of employment. And when we look at the social reality of Latin America, we can say that the pandemic expressed in all its horrible glory, the structural and deep inequalities that Latin America has presented throughout the 20th and 21st century. I'm going to concentrate on the impact, on the measures, and on the post-shock first phase. I don't want to call it recovery. I think it's too soon to do that, but we can call it a post-shock first phase, or a phase that includes vaccinations and that changes the environment overall. In terms of poverty, we know that Latin America has lost 10 years of progress. That's more or less what ECLAC is telling us in terms of the number of people below the poverty line. This impact was expected. We had an acute, generalized, and asymmetrical social impact of the pandemic crisis. Not only did poverty increase, but there's also two additional data that we should look at. One is the intensity of poverty increased. That is, the mean distance of the average income of the poor to the poverty line also increased. And the relative distance of what we call the emergent sectors, or non-poor but vulnerable sectors, decreased relative to the poverty line. So overall, we are in a situation where many years of progress have been undone. Inequality has increased. We don't have precise data on inequality and to reconstruct the series of inequalities, but for the countries that we do, we see in all of them an increase in the Gini coefficient by family income or by wages. I mean, we should have expected this. Teleworking and the measures to contain the virus implied that the impact was going to be asymmetrical. Now the question is, what were the measures that were taken? Before I go into that, I want to call our attention to two additional non-monetary impacts, or impacts that are not measured on monetary terms, usually that were very strong. One was the closure of schools, and this had a major impact on children's welfare, and it will have a major impact intertemporally in terms of productivity and educational credentials. The second one is the closing of many health services non-COVID related. We know that as well as with educational aspects, health and education are chrono-sensible. That is, if you miss the window of opportunity at a certain age or at a certain moment, it's very hard to undo the harm that you will do. If you do not catch an oncological situation in sexual and reproductive health in time, then you will have harm that is hardly undone. And we are only starting to understand the magnitude of the impact that both educational and health service closures will have, has had, and will have in the future. What about the measures? Latin America did respond to the COVID pandemic with an expansionary fiscal policy to attempt to mitigate the social impact of the crisis. Now, when we evaluate overall how this fiscal expansion through monetary transfers, through support to micro and small enterprises, to guarantees so that they would still have water and electricity in their houses, etc. When we look at the different measures that were taken, we can say mostly without a doubt, this is relatively different for different countries, but we can say that on average, at least, there were three aspects that were not adequate. The first one was coverage. We did not reach all of those populations that would enter into a highly vulnerable phase. The second was sufficiency. Most of our monetary transfers were not enough to be able to stop people falling into poverty or increasing the intensity of poverty. And the third one was sustainability. While Brazil is an example of high fiscal expansion in the early phases of COVID, it mostly ran out of fôlego. It had no capacity to sustain this support as the social crisis unfolds in 2021. Now, one of the things that is clear here is that different countries reach the situation of the social crisis with different instruments. One of the major lessons that we can take away from the country's response to the crisis was that countries that had stronger, more universal social protection systems, especially social security and unemployment benefits, did better to confront the crisis than countries that had fragmented and insufficient systems. Let me now turn to the post-shock third phase or recovery. What we're looking at is, in the same way that we had an asymmetrical impact of the COVID crisis and containment measures on the social welfare of the population, we are having a K-shaped recovery. It is true that we're having a stronger than expected economic recovery, but at least the data that I have been looking at shows that this recovery is highly unequal, and that for a large part of the population, this recovery, both in terms of employment, income, and social protection measures, is not reaching in time, and it's not gathering momentum in 2021. We hope that as the economy keeps recovering, this will be something that will take place in a less K-shaped form. Secondly,
2 minutes remain.
This post-shock first phase is highly dependent on vaccination. The countries that have strongly vaccinated have been able to open their economies more and have a lesser impact on death and hospitalizations than others. We see that Latin America is three-tiered there. A group of countries doing well, another group of countries doing more or less well, and a group of laggards. And this is something that we have to take into account. Thirdly, as I mentioned before, the long-term impacts on non-monetized aspects of social welfare will only be seen clearly in the next years. And fourthly, the stock of resilience that households had as they confronted the crisis has been mostly depleted. We usually look at flows and we don't look at stocks, but the few surveys that have asked families what they did to confront the crisis, well, they got indebted, they had to sell things, they had to access this stock of resilience, and therefore this stock of resilience has been depleted. Let me close by calling our attention to what I believe are three, at least, multilateral failures of the global order in order to confront the COVID crisis. The first one has to do with the incapacity to create a global fund that would be redistributive to create a basic social protection floor in countries of least developed and middle developed countries. Secondly, vaccine distribution. We have seen the problem of vaccine distribution and access in many countries, parts of them in Latin America. Third is a failure that has not yet been documented, but I believe might happen, is how are we going to confront the increasing debt that our countries have gone into to confront the realities of the COVID pandemic. Debt relief and the discussion at the global order regarding debt relief will be a challenge, and I suspect probably another failure. All this said, we do expect the next 2 or 3 years to be better both in economic terms and in social terms. Yet, the region will probably emerge from this crisis and the management of the endemic nature that the crisis will assume in the next 2 or 3 years, more unequal and more poor. Think tanks, multilateral institutions, and of course governments have therefore a big challenge ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Figueira, for the perfect use of your time. Now I would like to invite Ms. Cornelia Schmidt-Lehrman to give her speech. Please, Ms. Cornelia, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to sharing my ideas with you. For the beginning, I really agree with the diagnostic from Felipe Figueiras. It's perfect for our region. The only difference is for Argentina, that Argentina is not recovering as well as we really need for this region. But let me speak about my personal view, that the core of the leader's position should focus on the combined health, social and economic effects of this pandemic, and we need to send strong signal to the world by committing to an equitable distribution of vaccines and treatments. Because it goes without saying that vaccination is starting point to solve the problem, but the pandemic is not fixed only by vaccine. It is fixed when we are able to agree on access, production and distribution of vaccine, and we need to do that. I believe that while finding short-term solutions to the pandemic and restoring economic stability will be high on the international agenda and should also focus on addressing challenges that will extend beyond the pandemic, such as climate change, energy use, food security, migration, as well as new education for new jobs. Because our region here in Latin America has a positive point. In addition to many natural resources that we must take care, we have an age of our population that is young. The age structure of the population is much younger than the European Union, for example, or the USA. While in Latin America, the average age is 31 years. In the EU, it is 43. And in the US, it is 38 years. So for me, it's very important that we point out what can we do for the young people. And in this case, it's also important to restore the reliability and the trust to this important multilateralism and this important international organization. We need to show the young people that international collaboration is a good thing. From this perspective, I think we must introduce in this organization and government an ability to establish the basis of inclusive and sustainable governance. And as each country of the world has felt a loss in this pandemic, I think everyone lost something: freedom, education, jobs, family. So now we need to support the role of the family as a foundational to society and as a source of health support and care. We so need to find new common solution to old problems, but with a humanistic approach. We need to find answers that really put the family at the center. Because, as I have said before, in each family we can find there was a feeling of loss. And that is what we need to recover and to transmit in a multilateral thinking hope. So, Figueira spoke about the debts. And maybe the packages that could be designed from the IMF or the World Bank should be challenged through programs that prioritize, at first, the maybe assistance to restructuring our sovereign debts, And in second place, that we reach programs for global financial assistance to recover the most affected economies. Because if we don't recover these economies, there will be no possibility of globalization and multilateralism. On the other hand, it's important to see that the different international organizations like the G20 can show a multinational approach, coordination and cooperation at the highest level of governance, but it will not only accelerate a successful response to COVID, but also have a positive impact far beyond the pandemic itself if we introduce also the point of view of the private economy and of a humanity searching for solutions. So maybe taking in account that we will need a lot of time to see what happens with this health crisis, maybe we need to find also new ways to invite the private sector to participate in global solutions. For our phenomenon here in Argentina,
2 minutes remaining.
We have a loss of opportunity. We don't use the COVID to find solutions, and maybe we can recover that in the way by participating more regional, thinking of a Mercosur that must be stronger and flexible, and showing that we have a choice: health, nationalism, or human solidarity. For us, the conclusion is together we are stronger. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cornella. Now I would like to welcome Professor Feliciano Guimarais. Professor Guimarais, it's over you. And of course, we encourage everyone who is watching to send questions or comments via chat. Professor Guimarais, please.
Thank you, Fernanda. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'd like to thank the invitation made by Professor James McGann to participate at this Latin American Think Tank Summit. It's my first one. I'm new at SEBRI. I'm a professor at the University of São Paulo, and I've been working with SEBRI in the last year or so. So it has been a great experience to talk more often with think tanks and see how think tanks tackle international issues. So my talk here, it's the title of my talk is Regionalism Under Stress and Paralyzed During the COVID-19 Pandemic. So my argument is that Latin American regionalism failed tremendously during the pandemic to coordinate efforts among its most important countries. Right? So Latin American regional institutions seem to be overstressed and paralyzed during the pandemic. UNASUR, for example, considering an auspicious integration project after its foundation in 2008, has effectively dissolved following the announcement in April 2018 by more than half of the member states to suspend their participation. Other Latin and South American regional organizations have also lost momentum before the pandemic, including CELAC, ALBA, and to a lesser degree, the Andean Community of Nations. More recently, Mercosur appeared to be collapsing with the irreconcilable positions of Brazil and Argentina in many issues, from trade to health policies. So since 2020, COVID-19 pandemic has not only constituted an additional stressing factor for a changing regional order, but it has also reinforced other stressing factors such as low rates of economic growth, the emergence of populism with nationalist traits in some countries, especially Brazil, and the repercussions of the conflict of the growing rivalry between the United States and China in Latin America. So previous and new stressing factors put regional organizations to a test in the last year or so. It is intuitively plausible that external pressures like COVID might cause a crisis, an additional crisis in regionalism, exacerbating pre-existing problems, triggering withdrawals from international organizations, or promoting institutional paralysis. Right? But the regional organizations and regionalism in Latin America were already failing before the pandemic. So did this regional organization cope well with the COVID in the last year and a half? No, they coped badly, especially in South America. South America was worse in the pandemic in terms of regional cooperation than Central America and Mexico. An easy comparison is to look at what the United European Union did and Asian countries did during the COVID pandemics, especially in the first phase in terms of cooperative actions to fight the pandemic. If you compare regional organizations from South America specific to these other regions of the world, you will see this striking difference in terms of regional cooperation. So the global pandemic was a novel to a region fraught with uncertainty. Since Latin America is among the hardest hit regions, as been shown in the previous presentations in terms of death tolls, it would have been beneficial to act together to contain the spread of the virus. But Latin American and inter-American regionalism was already in trouble and before the pandemic broke out. So the repercussions of the Venezuela crisis before the pandemic produced a negative feedbacks and made regionalism less resilient to the new stresses by reinforcing disintegrative tendencies. In addition, the demand for regionalism was already decreasing, especially from Bolsonaro in Brazil and López Obrador in Mexico. So the already light institutional structure of Latin American regionalism has weakened even more since the first decade of the first 21st century, a process that has been accelerated by the Venezuelan crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. So as a result, the region suffered what Professor Pauselli calls the disinvestment of spaces for multilateral policy coordination. Right? The countries are withdrawing from the region. Notably, secondary powers like Chile or Peru were crucial in establishing the Lima Group and Prosur a little before the pandemic. At least since the mid-2010s, no country has been willing to exercise leadership in regional integration. As we have been proven and shown by many studies, regional integration in Latin America, and specifically in South America, they rely or they depend on the leadership of some specific countries and the willingness of some political leaders to push for integration and cooperative measures. Right? Among the usual suspects, Mexico and Brazil predominantly focuses their attention on domestic affairs, and while their foreign policy was oriented towards extra-regional powers and not regional powers. It seems that López Obrador is changing in the last 6 months or so, but Bolsonaro has not changed at all. So while the combination of intergovernmental orientation and interpresidentialism gave impetus to regional integration in times of ideological affinities among presidents, these same factors now led to blockades and setbacks in times of polarization and lack of political consensus. In reality, COVID-19 only exacerbated pre-existing stressing factors, right? As I said. Also, COVID-19 not only revealed state capacity weakness, as being shown in a presentation by my colleague from Uruguay, in Latin America, and aggravated pre-existing challenges to democracy, but COVID-19 gave populist leaders either the opportunity to attack or circumvent institutional checks and balances and instrumentalize the crisis to deepen ideological polarization and mobilize their supporter, which seems the case of Mexico and Brazil as well, or allowed populist leaders to harden their reservations towards multilateralism and regionalism, which is the case of Bolsonaro. Anti-multilateral, anti-regional, and anti-international cooperation. Bolsonaro foreign policy aims to cooperate only with other conservative countries in the world, which is a handful of countries, 5 or 6 countries. So none of them are in Latin America. And in addition to that, which is the worst for someone who is from Brazil, like myself and my other colleagues here, is in the case of Brazil, we saw that the government decided to adopt a very controversial regional policy, health policy in the pandemic. The ongoing Parliamentary Investigation Commission in the Brazilian Senate, responsible to investigate Bolsonaro policies during the pandemic, has found strong evidence that the Brazilian government has deliberately adopted a herd immunity, a health policy based on the principle of herd immunity to protect the economy and save Bolsonaro's chances of re-election. So when the most important country in South America decides, excuse me?
2 minutes
2 minutes. Sorry. When the most important country in South America decides to choose, the federal government chooses a health policy based on herd immunity, which means acting to infect as many people as possible to speed up the pandemic in Brazil, to create an immunity so that it can recover the economy faster for the election the next year. How can you expect the other South American, the neighboring countries of Brazil will cooperate with Brazil in any issue in terms of health policies? It's impossible for countries like Argentina or Paraguay, Uruguay, or Peru, or even Venezuela, Colombia, any of these countries, to sit with Bolsonaro's government to decide anything together in terms of regional policy. There was a paralysis in the regional institutions, and the Brazilian government decides chooses a policy that created crimes against humanity. I'm sure that Bolsonaro will be one day convicted for that, right? So regional cooperation is collapsing in Latin America. It was already collapsing before the pandemic, and now it's collapsing even further, among other factors, many of them previous to the COVID, and also because Brazil has decided to sabotage any regional policy to fight the pandemic. If you take a look at the regional policies that Bolsonaro did, you'll see that. From an optimist perspective, it can be affirmed that despite the regional disintegration, some regional organizations tried and made played a better role in this crisis. Instead, CELAC recently seems to be being reenacted. The Central American Integration System, SICA, was very important to exchange information, create support networks in the face of the pandemic. The Pan American Health Organization tried to fulfill its role, but as former Fiocruz president Paulo Bus said, PAHO, Pan American Health Organization, always needed other regional organizations to implement its policy, and they were paralyzed at the time, so it was very difficult for the Pan American Health Organization to coordinate efforts in region, and Brazil was sabotaging that at any time, all the time. Some in the literature, some argue that regional organizations with a stronger institutionalization, a more technical orientation, and a less political polarization function even during the pandemic crisis. That was the case of SICA and PAHO. And that was not the case of UNASUR or Organization of American States. But Mercosur could have played this role because it's more institutionalized. It's a very old institution. It has been working with 4 countries for many years now. But Brazil decided to paralyze it as well. In some previous conditions had already weakened regional cooperation in Latin America, but when the pandemic hit, this scenario was ripe for institutional paralysis. Still, if Brazil and other countries had decent governments, the pandemic could have been used to revival regional cooperation in Latin America, and that was not the case. So Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil made sure that regionalism will never prosper during his tenure, and the pandemic showed this very clearly and very tragically in the Brazilian case. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to hear questions.
Thank you, Professor Guimarais. About the questions, we have a bunch of them. So I'm here trying to organize. And my suggestion, since we have just 10 minutes, is that we can maybe read them all in a row. And I can suggest who is answering each one based on your presentations, or of course in the indication of those who made the questions. Is that all right for you? Okay, so I would like to start with a question made by Alexander Seriduk. And this question I would like to be answered by Professor Guimarais and Professor Julio Croda, if they can. So the question is, regarding the state of trust that the public has in think tanks throughout the region, how it changed with the COVID crisis, and how are think tanks trying to be more approachable and trustworthy, meaning how think tanks are trying to be closer to the people and have public support for some of the reforms and radical changes that are needed in the part due to the COVID itself. So first question to Professor Guimarais and Professor Croda about think tanks and the way they are dealing the pandemic crisis. Then I have a question to Fernando Filgueira, specifically from Boni Baesh. And the question is, are you using the Social Progress Index to measure these impacts on the society and report to the people? It resonates with the people more than GDP when trust and respect are low. So Professor Filgueira, this is for you. Then we have two questions for Mr. Werner. The first one is, I'd like to ask Mr. Werner, which countries in our region would have better prospects for economic and social recovery, and under what kind of policies we could expect they will promote it? And also the Social Progress Index provides indicators to measure the questions that were made. And at least we have a question for Ms. Cornelia from Sunny Villa. The question is, talking about the need of a new social contract, how would it be the woman role and how to consider it into the fiscal systems? So a lot of questions. If you need me to repeat them, it will be my pleasure. Since we have just 10 minutes to answer all these questions, my suggestion is that you all be very concise, please. I will start by Professor Guimarais and then Professor Croda for the first question.
Thank you, Fernanda. You made a thank you. The question from the audience. As I said in the beginning, I'm new into with think tanks, so I don't know much about think tanks. So I cannot answer this question satisfactorily. But I think that both think tanks and social movements, in the case of Brazil and other countries in the region, have been very important during the pandemic in terms of coordinated efforts to bring to the government social demands during the pandemic. In the case of Brazil, the government, as I said, have chose this very controversial health policy, and it was think tanks and social movements and also professional politicians the first ones to bring forth the negative effects of the health policy that the government was trying to implement. If it wasn't for the Supreme Court and for these movements and think tanks to call the government up, the situation in Brazil would have been much worse. So I think that this is what think tanks can always do: bring together intelligent specialists in many issues and pressure governments to do the right thing or to do policies based on evidence instead of policies based on ideological preferences. So thank you very much for the question.
Excellent. So now, Professor Croda, in the same way, like answering as a tweet, very fast.
Okay, if no response, we need to move on.
Okay, so let's go for the next one. The question made to Fernando Filgueira, please.
Okay, let me just take the question. No, I was not looking at the Social Progress Index. The Social Progress Index is, of course, one of the instruments you can look at. I was looking at data published by the World Bank and by ECLAC on measures of poverty and inequality. Let me just say two more things regarding overall questions that were there. I do believe that a new social contract does require a focus on women because they have paid most of the cost from schools closing, employment backlash, etc., etc., etc. And finally, as an overall issue that I believe Cornelia mentioned very well, and Jim mentioned at the start, the frequency and intensity of disruption is going to become uh, the the constant, and this is not and cannot be interpreted as external shocks. These are endogenous shocks uh, of the global dynamics. So we need a multilateral system that is able to assume that and to create the cooperation mechanisms that will help us navigate these new waters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Werner.
Thanks, Fernanda. The first question was kind of which countries are better placed to navigate the economic and social recovery. I would say that I think Feliciano kind of helped me in answering that question, because first from the political side, I think, I mean, those countries in which the political system now is kind of in the middle of a very polarizing phase, I think are pretty badly placed to reach a consensus, to move forward such a broad, encompassing agenda that let's say the social contract aspects, the economic aspects, and the productivity aspects. So on the political side is that, and obviously it's very clear which countries I'm referring to. Then you have countries that where trust in government, trusting in the systems that society has developed to design policies is much higher, like Uruguay. I think regardless of the current government and the previous government, are much better placed to move forward. There's much more trust. There's much more will to work together. It's completely crazy to see that an external shock, a health shock, etc., has been basically a source of polarization instead of a source of social unity and try to move forward. So I think that's very important. And I think in countries that were polarized, but at least are in the midst of a social process to work their differences, at least are better placed, like Chile, within the Constitutional Assembly, with the debate being channeled at least through well-established processes, instead of just playing it out on the electoral field in a very polarizing way. The role of women, I think, as it was said before by the previous speaker, I mean, obviously in COVID, I mean, low human capital, women were severely hit on the labor market. As he also said, I mean, in terms of work versus work at home, they took the brunt of the cost of adjustment. And then women were a sector of society that, thinking of a new social contract or social policies even before the pandemic, was very important to address. So I think obviously there's a huge role. I mean, also the problems that we're having in Latin America today, it's a problem of a perception of a lack of legitimacy of the current system. And obviously the women issue is a very clear source in which it is very clear that the system was not given the answers that we need to have women being as productive as they should be, and having the possibility to undertake their personal and their professional aspirations fully. And I think that's why it should be a very important part of the social contract. It implies, I mean, obviously, addressing a lot of gender issues that we have in our legislation. It is focused on obviously addressing health issues, in addressing childcare issues, addressing childcare leave, etc. So I think there's a lot of issues to be tackled there, and it's a very important issue, both because of the scars that COVID is leaving, but also because of the gender biases we already have, de jure and de facto, in our society, and those things have to be tackled.
Thank you very much. And now the last one to answer, please, Ms. Cornelia, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. We always used to speak about the importance of women, but I want to say the only really important solution is to understand that for women, the personal and professional increasement comes together. So we have to find solutions that makes that a woman feels comfortable doing their job. So what we need is to help women to be economic independent. And that's very important. We can use digitalization, and we need to build an equal society with a humanistic approach. If we don't understand that the gender sector, it's a humanistic item, we won't find the real solution, because for women, their families are really important. So I repeat, maybe we can find debts, we can find credits for helping women to be economic independent, and that they could also take care of their families.
Thank you, Ms. Cornelia. So with that, we can close the session 2 of this event. And we are looking forward for the next session, the panel on general assessments and recommendations country by country. I would like to thank you all for your speeches and the audience for your participation. It was a great opportunity to be with you all. Thank you, Professor Jim, for the invitation. And I would like to invite you all to follow the Brazilian Center for International Relations, SEBRI, on the social media, and to follow our events and our publications as well. So thank you very much. Professor Jim, is over to you.
Thank you very much, Fernanda. And in terms of the last comment, in terms of women, we have launched, as you all know, a initiative breaking the glass ceiling in the ivory tower, women and think tanks. And I encourage all of you to join with us. And Angela, who's here today, will encourage you to join the initiative, and we'll put a link on in the chat. I am now pleased to introduce Carlos Javier Regazzoni from CARI, who will chair the next session. Carlos.
Many thanks. Good morning and good evening to everybody. I would like to thank Dr. James McGann from the Think Tank and Civil Society Program from the University of Pennsylvania, and also to the CARI, the Council on Foreign Relations from Argentina, that is my alma mater. I would like to quote Dr. James McGann from Pennsylvania, who a few minutes ago he said that there is not going to be no new normal. So to expect ahead the post-pandemic period is to expect ahead a very complex moment for our countries in South America and Latin America at least. First, because what happened in the world was such a severe event, the recovery will take several years and will be accompanied by even more profound transformations in the years ahead. Finally, the virus is really a complex threat. As an example, currently, the countries around the world with the highest incidence of the virus are among the largest countries in economical terms, and also among the most vaccinated countries ahead. So let's take a flight over Latin American countries in company of great speakers like Luis Fernando Mejia, Executive Director from FEDesarrollo Colombia, Gala Díaz-Langou, Executive Director of CIPEC from Argentina, Klaus Alexander de Freitas Tia, International Manager of Fundación Getúlio Vargas from Brazil, Claudia Umaña, President of Fundación Salvadoreña para el Desarrollo Económico y Social, FUSADES, from El Salvador, Christian Stewart, Executive Vice President of Idea País from Chile, Carlos Gueder, Senior Fellow of Se Dice Libertad from Venezuela, Elena Ford, Director and Founder of Democracia y Desarrollo Internacional from Peru, Jaime García, Regional Director of Social Progress Index of Centro Latinoamericano para la Competitividad y el Desarrollo Sostenible, CLADS, INCAE, from Costa Rica. Every speaker is going to have 4 minutes. I have my watch here to control that. And at the end, we are going to have a session of questions and answers, of course. So please, Dr. Luis Fernando Mejia, Executive Director of Fedesarrollo from Colombia, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Carlos Javier. Thank you, Jim, and all the team for organizing this conference. Hopefully the next one is going to be live and not virtual. Well, I'm going to go over some details about what's going on. What I already discussed in the previous session. First, Colombia suffered, of course, heavily in terms of output growth last year with a contraction of 6.8%. And when we began the year, we were actually forecasting a growth rate of about 4.8%. And as Alejandro mentioned, there were a few issues that we didn't incorporate, like the recovery
para mí no dicen nada, pero medio que deben decir estos pajeros que no
raise
avanzan.
of commodity prices. And we started with
Tipo,
4.8%, but then in June, we updated our forecast to 7.2%. And today, we are updating our forecast to 9.5%, so almost double what we expected at the beginning of the year. So that's a very important growth rate. We're going to be 2% above output levels of 2019. And that's very good news because Colombia is going to close the output gap. Now, in terms of unemployment, things are not as good. Unemployment rates were 10.5% in 2019. Then during the COVID crisis, unemployment rose to an average of 16.1%. And we see that unemployment is going to be around 13.5% this year. So there's going to be a 3 percentage points unemployment gap. And that's, of course, a worry because we feel that there has been some labor-saving technological progress, especially bias against lower skilled labor. That implies that we're going to have policies for retraining and making sure that these low-skilled workers go back to employment in the medium term. Now, in terms of poverty rates, of course, they rose as well. We have 36% level of poverty in the population in 2019. That rose to 43% last year, and we expect that given that even though output growth is going to be very high, but unemployment rates are going to be still higher than pre-pandemic levels, we're going to see poverty levels as low as 41%, but not going back to 2019. So that's an issue from the social side. Now, in terms of structural things that worry us, of course, fiscal deficit is an issue. I mean, it was a very important policy. It was counter-cyclical fiscal policy that helped during the crisis, but this year, the fiscal deficit is going to be, again, high, 8.6%. We also have a structural problem with our current account deficit that we estimate this year is going to be around 5.2%. So we're seeing the coming back of the twin deficits, so both high fiscal and current account deficits, which is going to put some pressure in terms of the medium-term adjustments. And finally, I would like to mention that from Fedesarrollo, we have actually published since April of this year a new book that we call Towards a New Social Contract, in exactly the sense that was discussed in the previous session, thinking about the reforms that have to be made so that inequality levels are lower in the short and medium term, and how to solve the informality problem that unfortunately is a malaise for most of Latin American countries. And the COVID-19 crisis, of course, brought forward the idea that unless we solve these issues and we have an inclusive growth, we have most of the workers in the formal side, it's going to be very difficult to reduce inequality levels and reduce poverty. So that's one thing that we contributed. We are going to be very active during the next couple of months in terms of trying to talk with all the presidential candidates, and hopefully some of those ideas are going to pick up to make some structural reforms. So thank you very much, Carlos Javier.
Okay, thank you, Luis Fernando, because the use of the time, that this was very sharp. So now is the time to Gala Diaz-Langó, Executive Director of CIPEC from Argentina. Your 4 minutes.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you for the invitation. It is lovely seeing you all and witnessing such wonderful presentations. If I would have been asked a couple of months ago at the early stages of this pandemic to provide a status report, I would have stated without much hesitation that we were facing a turning point and that whatever comes next after this global crisis will differ in several aspects from what we have seen in the past. Today, I am not that convinced, and I'm quite convinced that I was wrong. We have seen how the pandemic has highlighted and reinforced structural problems. The international vaccine distribution is a clear example of that. In Argentina, the pandemic has intensified a previous crisis and has widened pre-existing inequalities through what has happened at least in 3 spaces. The first one is at schools. Prior to the pandemic, 2 out of 4 adolescents had a timely completion of secondary education, and half of them had the basic competences. Due to the problems in continuing education from home, and particularly due to the barriers in accessing devices and connectivity to enable it, this has worsened during the last 20 months. The second space is the labor market. The months of lockdown and the recession that followed meant that many people saw an interruption of their incomes, mainly people who were inserted in the informal labor market. This has hit harder on younger people and especially on women. The third space is households. During the pandemic, we have seen an increase of non-paid work, firstly due to the higher sanitary standards and the cleaning that it meant, and secondary due to the care provision, especially due to the schools closure. This also impacted more on women who experienced an increase in time poverty. These inequalities are compounding at historically high levels and creating practically unmanageable sets of risks. But they are not new. In Argentina, as in many other countries, these problems were already structural, long before we learned where Wuhan was located. Particularly, we face structural problems surrounding 5 issues. The first one is education. The second one is poverty. In the past 30 years in Argentina, we weren't able to reduce poverty under a quarter of our population. Today, 40% of people who live in Argentina are living under poverty, and it is over 6 out of 10 kids, adolescents, children, who experience poverty. And this dialogues very badly with the demographic change that we are experiencing in Argentina. It is projected that in 2040 we'll have an elderly population, with most of our population with over 65 years old. And we will need those kids who aren't finishing schools and who are currently living under poverty to be more productive than what we are now today. The third one is how to grow. We haven't grown in the past 10 years in Argentina. Our current GDP per capita is the same one as in 1980. We need to potentiate our productive matrix, make it more sustainable, but also productive in terms of exporting services and goods and creating employment. The third one is the climate change. We were not able to mitigate the effects of the climate change globally, and we are now seeing its impact with increased intensity. And the fifth one is the macroeconomic stability. The historical persistence of these problems speaks volumes of our collective incapacity to resolve them. But there is also an opportunity to try to solve these problems again in Argentina. My country will be attaining for the first time in its history the milestone of 40 years of uninterrupted democracy in 2023. This is a huge achievement that evidences that we are capable of resolving some structural problems. In Argentina, we no longer use violence to solve our political differences, and whoever runs and wins an election takes office. This is an opportunity to achieve what Jim mentioned as one of the main roles of think tanks, to provide clarity and consensus and results to try to solve these problems. Thank you so much.
It was because just a small advantage of time because you are from Argentina too. So well, now it is time. Many thanks, Gala Diaz-Langó from CIPEC. And now it is time for Klaus Alexander de Freitas Tier, International Manager of Getúlio Vargas Foundation from Brazil. The stage is yours, Klaus.
Thanks a lot, Carlos, and thanks, Jim. for the invitation. It's a big pleasure to once again contribute to the Latin American Think Tank Summit, and really good to see some of the colleagues from past events here. So I'll give you an overview of Brazil's situation based on 3 pillars, mainly an update on the situation of vaccination in Brazil, social impacts of the COVID, and also a prospects for the economics in 2022. So I'll start with the good news, and it is Brazil has long sustained very effective national vaccination programs. This was not different with the COVID. And once the problem of vaccine purchase and production was solved, vaccines started to be offered through Brazil's health system. And also good news, despite several unfortunate federal government declarations, citizens adhered to vaccination. And the status today, we have reached yesterday 50% of the population fully vaccinated in Brazil, which means 260 million doses administered. So I think the world percentage is about 36%. Also good news, number of deaths is in constant decline, but still about 300 to 400 deaths per day, which is pretty high. General feelings that part of our 600,000 deaths could have been avoided. Brazil has also struggled a lot to keep the pandemic under control, holding high numbers of cases, neglecting massive testing, avoiding social distancing, which resulted in a very ineffective approach to the crisis. Social impacts of COVID. A report by FGV has been recently released, shows that COVID crisis affected severely the poor, and inequality have grown in Brazil compared to pre-pandemic levels, driven mainly by income losses, unemployment, and inflation. The impact was particularly felt among informal workers, women, and the elderly. Among the youth, there has been a lost year in public education with the closure of schools, so the consequences are still not clear, but definitely worrisome. An important financial aid provided by government has alleviated the situation in 2020, but after its suspensions and re-implementation in smaller amounts this year, poverty numbers rose up again very quickly. So Brazil's Gini index has reached its highest number on record on the second quarter of 2021. As a response, a new financial aid has just been approved by Congress this week. The question now is, where's the budget coming from? And this leads me to my last point, its prospects for economic recovery and presidential election in 2022. Well, Brazil lives a last decade in terms of economic growth and fiscal constraints. So general economic recovery is still below expected. GDP will grow approximately 5% in 2021, mostly rebound, and the economy coming back to normal. But predictions for 2022, market predictions expect the economy to grow 1% or even below that. And there are a lot of economic challenges, especially increased by high inflation. So inflation is now about 10% in the last 12 months in Brazil. So this is really, really bad news. We're experiencing a stagflation almost, so mostly attributed to Brazil's own faults and not to international environment, although there is a global supply chain disruption going on, which brings also inflation higher to the world, but we've not been able to do our homework here. So unclear fiscal policy, high currency devaluation, high inflation, high unemployment rate, about 14%, and risk of energy shortages, which would have been higher if the economy was in shape. Most important.
Regretfully, the time is over.
Just one second. Political risk. Marketplace already forecasting economic prospects based on next year's election, and the election will be huge polarized between ex-President Lula from Labour Party and President Bolsonaro. I would like to bring better news, but please don't kill the messenger.
Many thanks, Klaus Alexander de Freitas Stier of Fundación Getúlio Vargas from Brazil. Now it is time for Claudia Umaña, President of Fundación Salvadoreña para el Desarrollo Económico y Social from El Salvador. Please, everybody, feel free to send your questions that will be answered at the end through the chat. Claudia Umaña, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jim, and also to the rest of the panelists. It's been super interesting. So in the case of El Salvador, COVID-19 has not only been a public health crisis, but also it has affected the health of our young democracy. A greater concentration of power in the hands of the executive branch became possible, and that enabled a decrease in the effectiveness of our democratic institutions. According to the Democracy Index 2020 of The Economist, El Salvador has gone from being considered a flawed democracy to a hybrid regime. We have a fatigued democracy and a breakdown of our rule of law and the weakening of checks and balances. The pandemic really favored the fact that people felt much more vulnerable. And with that, strong leadership was appreciated. Particularly, the president gained an unprecedented level of popular support through the Congress election. He achieved a qualified majority, and with this power, the government replaced all of the Supreme Court justices of the Constitutional Chamber, the Attorney General of the Republic, and approximately 1/3 of all judges, all in violation with our current Constitution. With this concentration of power, also the Institute of Public Access to Information, that had been for 10 years the grantor of this right, was co-opted. And from that moment on, the reservation of information became the norm. Even themes that are so basic, like the purchases of vaccine, how the rollout of the vaccination program, or even specifics like health issues, all became reserved information. And with that, also many public procurement laws became so expedited that it avoided much accountability. With the deterioration of democracy, the highlight has been also the reduction of the civic space through attacks of freedom of expression and the right of association. And that has affected journalists and think tanks such as ours. There is much intolerance to social audit and evidence-based analysis. On the economic front, there is a growing public debt that is becoming unsustainable. In the wake of the pandemic, El Salvador proceeded to take a series of measures to mitigate the effects, such as the provision of vaccines, delivery of food baskets, subsidies of $300 per family, computers for children, and all of these measures were very popular. However, in 2020, the public debt rose to 90% of the GDP. On the social front, basically there was a rural population that faced challenges that were way worse than the urban population. On the women area, we have particularly affected because of domestic violence, more unpaid work, and the loss of formal employment. The greatest danger in this moment, and the words of Jean really resonate, we cannot keep doing the same things as we used to be. The challenge is, how do we reinvent ourselves to adapt and to act with resilient tools in these new circumstances? I have a couple of other comments that I wish to share with you in my next intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for the use of your time. Now it's the turn of Christian Stewart, Executive Vice President of IDEA Paris from Chile. Christian, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Carlos. The four aspects that we were supposed to break down today are precisely the four different crises that many people think that we're dealing with in Chile. So today I'm going to cover them by calling them crises. First, regarding the public health crisis, I would like to highlight two aspects. The first is that Chile increased as much as 3 times the critical care beds capacity compared to pre-pandemic times, and crucially integrated the public and private sector to the network, which not only made the whole network available to any person with the disease, but also prevented us from facing what is known as the last bed dilemma. And the second aspect is that fortunately Chile today is one of the countries with the highest levels of vaccination coverage. More than 90% of the target population is fully vaccinated according to official data. And we are even vaccinated children between 6 and 11 and implementing a third dose for those above 55. And mainly because of these measures, Chile is, together with Uruguay, fortunately, with one of the lowest levels of mortality in South America, estimated as excess deaths. Turning to the second crisis, the social crisis, the most relevant data is that because of COVID, more than 2 million jobs were lost, which is equivalent to all the jobs created in the last 10 years. And to face this crisis, the government created a social protection network that considers more than $35 billion in transfers. And thanks to this significant measure of fiscal expenditure, poverty in Chile has grown only 2.2 measures measured as income. Third, regarding the economic crisis, bigger by far than both the Asian crisis and the 2008 financial crisis, Chile had a massive drop in economic growth of 5.8 points of GDP. However, the good news is that the economic recovery has been quite good. For example, the monthly economic indicator is at higher levels than pre-pandemic times. The projections suggest that the economic growth will be of 10% of this for this year. And out of the 2 million jobs that were lost, 1.2 million jobs have already been recovered, which is in this dimension. We think that we will be back to normal by this month. And last but definitely not least, I close with the political crisis that Alejandro Werner mentioned briefly. The COVID-19 pandemic arrived in the middle of a political crisis where two equally real aspects coexist. First, a social outburst or estallido social with violence in the public space since October 2 years ago. More than 30 people have died, 77 subway stations were set on fire in Santiago in only one day, and many small and medium-sized companies had to close. And the second dimension of this crisis is the incapacity of politics to process several legitimate demands and of translating Chile's macroeconomic performance to effective redistribution policies that give legitimacy to the development model. And just to finish, all this led to the current process where we are now, with a process of creating a new constitution and the presidential elections in 1 month. These processes entail the political tensions, which I think will lead us to a crucial turning point where either democratic legitimacy or populist instability can prevail. I hope, of course, stability wins, but of course, only time will tell. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Christian. Now it's time for Carlos Goeder, Senior Fellow at Se Dice Libertad from Venezuela. Carlos, it's your turn. We cannot hear you, Carlos.
Maybe we can come back to him.
Yes. Carlos, your microphone is closed.
All right, we need to move on.
Okay. Carlos, try to resolve the problem of communication, and then we are going back to you. So we are going to give the time for Elaine Ford, Director and Founder of Democracia y Desarrollo Internacional from Peru. Elaine Ford.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you very much, and good morning to you all. Thank you, Jim. I feel delighted to be here. Unfortunately, I have to describe a reality about Peru that it is not very positive and encouraging, but nevertheless, I try to see the light with the perspective of the future and always to see half of the glass full. After the pandemic, Peru has had a difficult year in 2021. The pandemic hit us hard, with more than 200,000 deaths and more than 2 million infections today, a situation that was exacerbated by the terrible conditions of the health system, lack of ICU beds, lack of oxygen plants, lack of hospitals with the capacity and personnel to care for the high number of infected population. The pandemic revealed that we were not prepared to face such a tremendous crisis. Fortunately, today more than 50% of the population is fully vaccinated. The pandemic also brought us economic crisis and recession because we had a very strict quarantine, very drastic measures that especially affected small and medium-sized companies, measures that even some of them are still in place today, such as children still not attending school. Education remains online in a country where the rural population has little access to the internet, which does not even reach 45%, and where teachers have no training in the use of new educational technologies. And all of the above is added to the political crisis that we have lived through, inherited from the 5 years of the previous government, with an excessive polarization of political forces. In 2021, we have had presidential and congressional elections. 3 months ago, a new president and 130 congressmen took office in Peru. The current president, Pedro Castillo, is a school teacher from the Andes, trade unionist, leader of a leftist party, Peru Libre, and this party is also highly questioned for its links with the terrorist movement Sendero Luminoso or Shining Path. This situation has generated alarm among investors, the country risk has increased, and the dollar exchange rate has risen. There is a lot of instability and uncertainty due to the type of policies that were announced throughout the campaign. However, apparently there is a break within the Peru Libre party, and there are two main forces which want to have control inside the party. Pedro Castillo has shown to be moderating, distancing himself from the more radical left-wing policies and moving closer to the political center. This could be quite positive, as it would allow continuity to the policies implemented today, which led the country to achieve sustained growth. So, thinking positive, we trust that the current government will address the priorities and needs of the country instead of promoting actions to seek the perpetuate of himself in power by changing the constitution, for example, as it has been seen in countries under the Bolivarian Chavist model. Finally, I must say that in this stage, I believe that there is a lot to be done from think tanks to influence in the public policies and decision making, to promote and disseminate content and evidence related to freedoms and economic prosperity. And it is also necessary,
we are in time.
And it's also necessary to support the rise of new movement from civil society to train them, share knowledge with them. There is a lot to be done. Thank you very much.
Please, it was a pleasure. Here, Carlos Gueder from Venezuela tells us that the technical problems have been solved. So try to take your time, Carlos. No, apparently
not. So,
oh, okay.
Let's move on to Jaime, please.
Yeah. Okay. Now it's the time for Jaime Garcia, a Regional Director of Social Progress Index. of Centro Latinoamericano para la Competitividad y el Desarrollo Sostenible from Costa Rica. Jaime, it is your time.
Thank you, Carlos Javier. Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to be with you. In terms of Costa Rica, this multidimensional crisis brought us back 4 or 5 years in terms of social progress and increased citizen unrest. The crisis affected years of advances in economic outcomes. If you see the impact on income, for example, measured by GDP per capita adjusted for purchase parity, in 2019, we were almost with 21,000. In 2020, we got $19,600 per capita, similar to levels of 2016. These trends, we have seen it in other social indicators. The crisis diminishes the opportunities of different groups in the society and increase the gaps. Women's, for example, in terms of women's empowerment, was clearly affected by decreasing their economic participation. In 2019, we had almost 50% of women in a productive age in the economically active population. Now we have 46%, with similar levels to 2017. In terms of public health, this crisis, of course, COVID-19 dominated the agenda, affecting other public services, and the health system, even without collapsing, was affected in its performance and services. One example are waiting times for surgeries in the public system. In 2019, we have 341 days, and in 2020, we have an increase of 93 days because of COVID-19. This performance is similar to 2018. Now, all these problems in terms of economic, in terms of social gaps, in terms of a lack of public services also generated protests and citizens' unrest. 2020 has been the year with the higher level of protests and demonstrations since the last 10 years. Universidad of Costa Rica has measured this, and we have seen that in 2019, the number of protests and demonstrations were 853. In 2020, we have 1,300 protests. But this was not also about the level, but the characteristics and the quality of these protests. There was a change in the nature of the protests, with 50% of them led by civil society and businessmen, displacing unionized workers, which were the traditional group with the most protests. Now, this civil unrest, and with these characteristics, will affect the presidential elections that we are going to have in the next months. Now we have 32 candidates that are going to compete for the government in Costa Rica. Some of them were involved from those protests or are supported by those groups. And of course, we have a polarized country, and we are going to have a polarized election process. So when we are seeing the different indicators and these conditions, it's clear that when talking about recovery, we need to go beyond economic growth, and needs to be based on a multidimensional approach with a high participation of private sector and think tanks, of course, because we have a public health system overwhelmed, a country with less economic resources, a society with higher inequalities, and of course, an unstable social contract. If we don't tackle these issues and understand them good, we are going to have a recovery that can be slow, uneven, and uncertain. And those are the challenges that we are seeing right now here in Costa Rica, because the crisis, as the others members of the panel have explained, goes beyond the health. This is a multidimensional problem that is affecting the way we are generating income, we are generating opportunities, and of course, in some countries, as in Costa Rica, that we have some problems specifically in terms of fiscal and expenditure of the government, we are going not to have the resources to tackle all this in a very efficient way. That's why the call from CLATS, from INCAE, is to work in a collaborative way, using the tools, the data tools that we have in the academia, in the think tanks, to help the government to understand how to tackle this in a very efficient way. If not, the recovery will be slow, and we are going to be back in the 2017 or in 2018, and with a very low level of economic growth and also low level of increase in social progress. Thank you.
Many, many thanks, Jaime. Well,
Can you
we're all
hear me
done.
now? This is Carlos. Can you hear me now? This is Carlos.
Yes.
Oh, yes, I can hear you.
Oh, well, fortunately, I changed to the mobile phone. Thanks God I was not giving a speech
go
about blue
ahead.
jeans. Sorry, I'm new to the application.
Go ahead.
Thank you for the patience. Well, I don't want to mention things that you already know, I don't want to generate pain about Venezuela, but try to figure out solutions. We know that the Nobel Prize this year was awarded to natural experiments, and perhaps Venezuela may be a natural experiment. The context of this economy that is particular and is not shared by the other countries we have discussed so far is that we have an authoritarian regime that is clearly leftist populism, and is also under international economic sanctions. This means that Venezuela has not obtained any special line of credit by the International Monetary Fund or other international organizations due to the outstanding sanctions. And this context has been exploited by the authoritarian regime to say that all the bad management or mismanagement of the problem is caused by this problem. The first problem we have is opacity in statistics. The official numbers say that Venezuela has around 400,000 cases and less than 5,000 deaths in a country with nearly 30 million inhabitants. We have mentioned the case of neighboring Colombia that has nearly 10% of its population, nearly 5 million cases, and nearly 130,000 casualties. May they rest in peace. So these statistics do not make any sense. The official numbers about vaccination are less than 20% of the population. A worse and more significant number, and I just shared a report issued yesterday by the CEPAL. I know it's not the most popular organization for libertarian organizations, but the statistics are quite good. And in the case of Venezuela, the average expenditure on health, adding private and public expenditure, is just $500 per inhabitant. And we know that the average in the OECD is $4,000. So the numbers are terrible. In this dismal picture, we have been working in a country that is with negative economic growth of 4%, and this is a good number for us because we have been shrinking our economy in nearly 80% in this decade. So this is a good number for us. And the inflation is close to 3,000%. The poverty in our country is nearly 96%. In the region is 40%. In this dismal picture, I want to dedicate these last seconds to find out some solutions. The first, most of the people are relying on the out-of-pocket expense in health, using remittances from their people abroad. Nearly 25% of Venezuelans relied on this kind of assistance from the nearly 5 million people that left the country and sent money from abroad. As think tanks, we are approaching to promote education in the health of economics. We have been working with Dr. Gustavo Villasmil, a doctor in Venezuela who got Kovit himself and is not present here. He has been working with Vargas, solving cases and trying to promote that the private sector help to handle this situation with NGOs and think tanks that help to promote education about health and about management of this kind of crisis. Okay. I just want to stop here. We may share more ideas later.
Great. We run out of time. Many, many thanks. It was so important to listen to you from Venezuela. James, I don't see any question in the chat, so probably we would like to have your final remarks to this flyover Latin American countries.
Yes. First, what an extremely valuable and information-rich discussion to provide, as I intended, both a regional overview and then snapshots from key countries and ending, and I'm so glad that we were able to resolve the technical difficulties and hear from our colleague in Venezuela. One thing I didn't mention, which I think is relevant, and some have referenced going back to 2016, 2017. My great fear is what I would describe as a hydrodemic that we have COVID plus political and social crises, which I think are very likely in Latin America, and we need to prepare as institutions for that reality. We need to shift our time horizon. The reality, and many feel that the midterm and long term is where think tanks should focus their time and energy and their research. The reality is we may not have a midterm or long term, that think tanks now have an additional challenge to be able to explain, not to predict, but to explain why people are in the streets, what are they protesting, and are there other issues involved for the policymakers in the country. And so hydrodemic